Hi, today we'll be examining different feminist perspectives in relation to prostitution and the law. The current law in the UK is that the act of sex and paying for sex is legal, but the act of soliciting in public and the owning and managing of a brothel is criminalized. This seems to reflect a radical feminist view, except that radical feminism condones the idea that people should be allowed to pay for sex. Apart from critically analyzing the radical feminist view, this presentation will also discuss liberal feminism and ultimately postmodern feminism, which our group agrees with the most. Radical feminism is a perspective that calls for radical reordering of society in which male supremacy is eliminated in all social and economic contexts. Radical feminists are of the view that in most cases, prostitution is not a conscious and calculated choice. Hence, they take a very sympathetic approach and see them as victims. They claim that most women who become prostitutes do so because they're forced or coerced by a pimp or by human trafficking, or when it's an independent decision, it's generally the result of extreme poverty or other serious underlying problems or unfortunate circumstances. In Catherine McKinnon's words, in prostitution, women have sex with men they would never otherwise have sex with. The money thus acts as a form of force, not as a measure of consent. It acts like physical force does in rape. They see prostitution as a form of male dominance, as it puts the woman in a subordinate position, reducing her to a mere instrument of sexual pleasure for the client. These feminists believe that many clients use the services of prostitution because they enjoy the power trip they derive from the act and the control they have over the women during the sexual activity. Catherine McKinnon argues that prostitution isn't sex only. It's you do what I say, sex. Radical feminists takes after the Swedish model by advocating to criminalize the purchases of sex while leaving the selling of it legal. In their opinion, it would stop the demand and the supply would inevitably be cut off. This approach has been adopted by Norway, Iceland, and more recently, Canada in the late 2014 and Northern Ireland in 2015.
There are, however, severe limitations to the validity of radical feminist claims. We will be looking at two of these in particular. First, radical feminists do not view prostitution as a harmless private transaction. On the contrary, they state all women are affected by the coercive, exploitative, and oppressive inclinations of men towards women. But this is not always the case, as there does indeed exist a form of prostitution which is harmless and private in nature. Priscilla Alexander, a famous feminist and sex workers' rights advocate, stated that many sex workers actually voluntarily exchange sex for money and, in fact, defy the patriarchal system by capitalizing on their human sexuality. Undeniably, there may be those who willingly sell their services to pay for tuition or to afford luxury goods, amongst a number of other endless possibilities. Radical feminists also state the coercive effects of prostitution is the result of a male-dominated system that is equated to be on the level of rape. Yet the distinction between rape and prostitution is obscure, its logic tied to an abstract theory of degradation distant from presenting the actual sense of the word degradation. Radical feminists further believe prostitutes are the result of a system of male power because they unjustly focus on men as oppressors. Yet, they say little about the possibility of the woman being an oppressor of other women or even of men. And so, while the perspective adopted by radical feminists may have some merit, it is far too extreme to be socially acceptable as the one theory for describing prostitution and the system surrounding it. Through overgeneralizing concepts, radical feminists continue to view the law from an almost outdated and sexist perspective.
Now, we will examine the liberal feminist perspective, which is in stark contrast to the radical approach. Martha Nussbaum, a key liberal feminist, believes that prostitutes are not victims. Sex work is purely an individual choice and is similar to a business contract. In addition, the oppression faced by prostitutes would not be from gender inequality according to the statement in question, but from social stigma. This is reflected in everyday language when describing people with many sexual partners. Males would be called experienced or players, while females are called cheap and slutty. It is critical to consider what makes sex work much more stigmatized than other professions involving body parts, such as being a masseuse or a colonoscopy artist. This was touched on in Nussbaum's article, where ultimately it seems that the act of sex itself is a determining factor of the level of stigmatism attached to prostitution. Perhaps society still think, or would still like to think, of themselves as leaning on the conservative side of the fence and perceive sex as a sacred and highly reserved act. Liberal feminists, on the other hand, view that personal rights to choose a lifestyle should predominate over whatever society's general opinion is.
However, liberal feminism is not any less flawed than radical feminism. Firstly, its proposal to decriminalize sex work would not remove the stigma associated with the profession, which is argued by Nussbaum to be the main issue needing to be resolved. Although decriminalization and regulation would prevent it from entering the black market, public perception would not be so easily changed just by amending black-letter law. We believe that education is a more effective solution. Discussions and exposure to the existence, origins, and works of prostitution would normalize the situation and render it just like any other profession. Perhaps an even more obvious and pressing issue that liberal feminists neglects is the fact that not all sex workers fully consent to joining the profession. While there may be some prostitutes who do engage in sex work purely for business, we cannot ignore the fact that coercion into the profession does occur. However, Nussbaum addresses this problem by suggesting using the law to facilitate the exercise of autonomy. Providing access to resources would not only help maintain one's bodily health and integrity and control over one's environment, but also, more importantly, assist in keeping the prostitutes informed of alternative occupations beyond prostitution. Only in doing so would prostitution be seen as a result of a more autonomous choice. Lastly, we need to be wary and consider if the morals of society could or should be changed so radically. As idealistic as it may sound, to use decriminalization and provide alternatives outside the profession to achieve the goal of removing the stigma attached to prostitution, we fear that this may be too big a step in practice. Having a moral consensus is essential to the well-being of society, and to demand that stigma be abandoned altogether might be too revolutionary. The law should reflect the collective values of the members of its society rather than coerce a change of values amongst its
values
members.
of today's society in practice. Postmodern feminism sets out that it is the language of the law that defines the subordinate position that women suffer from. Legal rules meant for the benefit of women have actually had the opposite effect of reinforcing the gender divide, entrenching the gender roles in legislation. Because of how anti-prostitution legal rules focus on the sex workers themselves, the image of the kind of sex that is looked down upon has been integrated into the view of society, resulting in the stigma that sex workers face, that what they do is immoral and debasing. This is emphasized by what would seem to be the approved kind of sex, that which happens, for example, in the course of a marriage or a happy, loving relationship, and this can be seen where the family courts will actually take sexual relations as a relevant factor in their deliberations. Our group believes that the way forward involves legislative change in relation to sex work and that prostitution as a service should be institutionalized. Putting further restrictions and punishments on prostitution, such as if we were to follow the view of radical feminism and criminalize the purchase of sex, would only drive prostitution or its clientele underground or further into cyberspace instead. Indeed, it would make prostitution even more lucrative as black markets arise. Institutionalization of prostitution would drive the practice above ground and not only allow sex workers the protection of the law, but also allows the government to regulate the industry, similar to how the adult film industry is managed. Thank you for listening to us.